My dad cut me out of his will. What I didn't know was that I had the original copy hidden in a shoebox under my bed. Let that sink in for a second. The man who raised me, who promised me everything would be taken care of, who looked me in the eyes at my grandmother's funeral and said, "Son, this family sticks together no matter what." That same man signed a new will 3 months after marrying a woman he'd known for less than a year. And he thought that was the end of it. It wasn't. If you've ever been betrayed by someone you trusted completely, if you've ever watched a manipulative person slowly dismantle everything you thought was solid in your life, or if you've ever wondered whether the legal system can actually deliver justice when it matters most, this story is for you. Because what happened to my family, what I uncovered, and what went down in that courtroom is something I still can't fully believe was real, but it was. Every single detail. Stay with me, because this gets complicated, it gets ugly, and the twist in part 2 of this story, which I'm going to set up completely today, is something that genuinely made the opposing lawyer go pale in the middle of his argument. I need you to understand everything that led to that moment first. So let's go back to the beginning. My name doesn't matter. What matters is that I'm the only child of man I'll call my father, because that's what he was to me for 31 years. He was a contractor. Not flashy, not rich in the way people on social media throw the word around, but genuinely comfortable. He owned his house outright. He had a rental property. He had a retirement account that he'd been feeding carefully for decades. And he had the family home, the house where I grew up, where my mother died when I was 16, where every holiday and every milestone in my life had taken place. That house wasn't just an asset. It was a physical container of everything our family had been. My mother passed from cancer. It was slow and it was brutal, and my father was never quite the same after. He went quiet for a long time. Years, honestly. He dated a little here and there, but nothing serious. I grew up, went to college, got a job in another city, but we talked every Sunday. We were close, not in a showy way. We didn't post pictures together or make a big deal of it, but in the way where you know someone has your back and they know you have theirs. That was us. Then I got a phone call on a Tuesday afternoon that I still remember exactly where I was standing when it came through. My father told me he'd met someone. Her name was Renata. He said she was wonderful, said she made him feel like himself again, said he wanted me to meet her. I was happy for him. I genuinely was. My father had been alone for a long time, and whatever complicated feelings I had about someone new being in his life, I pushed them down because I loved him and I wanted him to be happy. I met Renata about 6 weeks later. She was younger than my father by about 14 years. She was polished, well-dressed, spoke carefully, laughed at exactly the right moments. She was, in other words, very good at making an impression. I remember thinking she seemed almost too well-calibrated, too aware of how she was landing with me. But I told myself I was being unfair. I told myself I was projecting. I smiled. I was friendly. I asked her questions about herself, and I drove home that night thinking it would probably be fine. It was not fine. Within 4 months of that dinner, my father announced they were engaged. I tried to talk to him about it. Gently, carefully, not accusatory. And I remember the conversation shifting in a way that felt wrong. He got defensive in a manner he never had with me before. He said I was being jealous, that I'd always struggled with sharing him, that Renata had warned him I might react this way. That last sentence hit me like cold water. She had warned him. Before I'd even expressed a single concern, she had already gone to him and planted the idea that my reaction would be about jealousy. She had framed my future objections before I could even make them. That's not something a secure person does. That's something a strategist does. I backed off. I told him I supported whatever made him happy. I told him Renata seemed like a lovely person. And I watched over the next several months as the small things started to accumulate. He stopped calling every Sunday. When I called him, conversations were shorter, like he was distracted or being overheard. He mentioned a few times that Renata felt I was too involved in his finances, which was absurd because I had never once inserted myself into his financial life. He started declining invitations to visit me. He missed my birthday dinner with an excuse that didn't quite add up. And then, the Christmas that was supposed to be the first one with Renata as his wife. They had gotten married in a small ceremony I was technically invited to but made to feel unwelcome at. I drove 4 hours to spend a holiday with my father and arrived to find that she had arranged for her own family to be there, 12 people I'd never met, and I spent 2 days sleeping in what used to be my bedroom, which now had different furniture and different photographs on the walls, feeling like a guest in the house I grew up in. I want to be clear about something. I'm not telling you this story to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you this so you understand the architecture of what was happening. Because Renata was not acting randomly. She was executing something. Looking back with everything I now know, the whole sequence was deliberate. Isolate the father from the son. Create friction. Position the son as a threat or a drain. Make the father feel that choosing his new wife over his old life is an act of love rather than manipulation. It's a pattern. It's documented. Family attorneys and psychologists who study elder financial abuse would describe exactly this sequence of steps to you if you asked them. I didn't know that then. I know it now. The moment I found out about the will, I was sitting in my apartment on a random Wednesday evening. I had gotten a call from my father's longtime attorney, a man named Gerald who had handled my family's legal affairs for over 20 years and who had drafted the original will my father had made after my mother died. Gerald was not my father's attorney anymore. He had been quietly replaced by a new firm that Renata had connections to. But Gerald called me because he felt he had an obligation to. He told me, as carefully as he could without breaching any ethical line he felt bound by, that he had heard through professional channels that my father had executed a new will. He could not tell me the contents. He could not tell me the specifics. But he felt I should know it existed. He told me to take care of myself, and he hung up. I sat with that phone call for about an hour. I want to describe what that hour felt like, because I think if you've ever had a moment where something you feared but told yourself wasn't real suddenly became confirmed, you'll understand. It's not rage right away. It's not even sadness. It's a very strange quiet, like the sound going out of a room. Like suddenly everything is very still and very clear, and you're looking at the shape of something you've been trying not to see. My father had made a will after my mother died. I knew this because he had told me about it directly years ago. He sat me down and explained what he wanted to happen to his estate. The house would go to me. The rental property would go to me. The retirement accounts had me listed as beneficiary. He was not a man who left things vague. He was a contractor. He liked things measured and documented and accounted for. And at that conversation, he had given me a copy of that will, not because he intended to die soon, but because he said it was the right thing to do, to make sure I had it, to make sure there was no confusion. That copy was still in a shoebox under my bed. I had not thought about it in years. It was just a document in a box with other documents I never looked at. But after Gerald's call, I went and got that shoebox and I found it. And I read it. And I sat on the floor of my bedroom holding those pages. And I thought about what it meant that I had them. Now, here's where I need to explain something, because this is the part that becomes legally significant, and I want you to follow it carefully. A photocopy of a will is not, in most circumstances, the legal instrument itself. The original signed document held by the attorney or the court is what controls. So having a copy of an old will doesn't automatically override a new one. That's not how it works. But, and this is very important, but what a copy of a prior will does is establish several things. It establishes intent at a specific point in time. It can be used to challenge the validity of a later will if there are grounds to believe the testator, that's the person making the will, was subjected to undue influence. It provides a baseline. It tells a story. And most importantly, it gives you a reason to start asking questions and a document to anchor those questions to. I called a probate attorney the next day. I had never hired an attorney in my life for anything, and I didn't know what I was doing, but I found someone with good reviews, and I made an appointment, and I went in with my shoebox. Her name was Patricia, and she was calm, methodical in a way that I needed desperately in that moment. I explained everything. The marriage, the timeline, the isolation, Gerald's call, the copy of the original will. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked me a series of questions. Was my father still alive? Yes. Did I know for certain that a new will existed? No. Only Gerald's strongly implied confirmation. Did my father have any diagnosed cognitive issues? Not that I was aware of, though I had noticed he seemed different, slower, more confused on some phone calls. In the past year, Patricia told me something I've thought about many times since. She said that undue influence cases are among the hardest to prove in probate law because they require demonstrating not just that someone had influence over the testator, but that the influence was so overwhelming it essentially replaced the testator's independent judgment. She said that the existence of a prior inconsistent will is useful, but not sufficient on its own. She said we would need more. And then she said something that changed the direction of everything. She said that if my father was still alive, the best thing that could happen was to have a genuine, documented conversation with him. Not confrontational, not accusatory, but conversation where I expressed my love for him, expressed my concerns about his well-being, and created a record of his current state of mind. I called my father that Sunday. It was the first time in months that I called without having a specific reason, and I could hear the slight surprise in his voice. We talked for almost an hour, and something happened in that conversation that I didn't fully understand at the time. He was warm. He was a version of my father I knew before Renata. He talked about a project he was working on in the garage. He asked about my job. He told a long story about something that happened at the hardware store that made both of us laugh. And near the end of the call, unprompted, he said, "I want you to know I think about you all the time. Not I love you, not I'm sorry, not any acknowledgement of the distance between us. Just that. I think about you all the time." I recorded that call. In my state, single-party consent recording is legal, meaning I could record conversation I was participating in without telling the other person. Patricia had told me to do this, not to use as a weapon, she said, but as documentation of his baseline cognition and emotional state. Because what we were quietly preparing for, what I hadn't let myself fully think about but was thinking about, was a possibility that my father might die with a will that cut me out, and that when that happened, we would contest it. I want to pause here for a second and say something honestly. I did not want to be in this position. I did not want to be strategizing about my father's death or building a legal case or recording phone calls. Every part of this felt wrong in the way that things feel wrong when you're doing something necessary that you wish you didn't have to do. I wanted my father back. I wanted to be able to call him and hear his voice and not be thinking about inheritance and attorneys and undue influence doctrines. But Renata had put us in this position. Her strategy had forced a counter-strategy, and I was going to be ready. Over the following months, I started quietly gathering everything I could. Old emails between my father and me, photographs from years of holidays with dates attached, cards he had sent me, voicemails I had saved, text messages, the pattern of contact over time, how often we spoke before Renata, how the frequency dropped after, how the nature of the conversations changed. I pulled bank records I had access to from a joint account we had used for family expenses, and which, I later discovered, had been closed shortly after the wedding. I talked to people who knew my father, his oldest friend, a man who had known him for 40 years, who told me he hadn't been able to get my father on the phone in months, and that when they did speak, he seemed not quite himself. His neighbor, who mentioned that Renata had apparently asked her not to drop by unannounced anymore. I want you to notice what's being built here. Not a story. Evidence. A chronology of isolation. A before and after. A documented shift in behavior and access that coincided precisely with the arrival and consolidation of Renata's influence. This is what a contestable case actually looks like in preparation. It's not dramatic in the moment. It's patient and methodical, and it's painful because every piece of documentation is also a reminder of something that was lost. My father had a stroke 14 months after he married Renata. It was not fatal, but it was serious enough that he was hospitalized for almost 2 weeks and spent another month in a rehabilitation facility. I found out because his neighbor, the one Renata had told not to drop by, called me because she had seen the ambulance and didn't know who else to contact. I drove to the hospital immediately. When I arrived, Renata was there. The interaction in that hospital waiting room was one of the most uncomfortable and clarifying experiences of my life. She was not hostile outright. She was controlled. She told me calmly that my father was resting and that the doctors had said he needed to limit stressful interactions. She said she was sure he'd be happy to see me, but that now wasn't a good time. She said she would let him know I had come. I asked to see him. I said I was his son, and I wanted to see my father. She said she would check with the nursing staff. And then she walked back to the door to his room, and I stood in that hallway for 2 hours. No one came out. When I finally went to the nurse's station and asked directly, they checked and told me the patient's wife had indicated he was not receiving additional visitors at this time. I left that hospital and sat in my car in the parking garage and did not move for a long time. I called Patricia from the parking garage. I told her what had happened. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Write down everything. The time you arrived, what Renata said, word for word as best you could reconstruct it, the names of any nurses or staff you interacted with, the exact phrasing they used. Do it now, before anything fades." I opened the notes app on my phone, and I wrote it all down. Because here's the thing about contestable cases and undue influence arguments. Courts look at a pattern. They look at access, who had it and who was denied it. They look at isolation. Was the testator cut off from independent relationships and influences? They look at timing. When were key decisions made, and what was the person's condition at that time? My father had a stroke. He was in a compromised physical and cognitive state. And in that state, I, his only child, had been kept out of his hospital room by his wife of just over a year. I need you to understand what I'm about to tell you, because this is where the story turns. This is the moment that everything I've been quietly building started to become something that could actually matter. 3 days after the hospital visit, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. It was a nurse. I'm not going to give any details that could identify her, but she had been on shift during my father's hospitalization. She had seen what happened in the hallway, and she told me that on the second day of my father's hospitalization, before his condition had stabilized, a man she described as a lawyer had come to the hospital with documents. She said Renata had been present. She said she didn't know what the documents were, but that she had been asked to witness a signature. She had felt uncomfortable, but had done it. And she was now calling me, she said, because she had been thinking about it and she felt it was wrong. A lawyer, documents, a signature. My father, 2 days into a serious stroke, signing something with his wife present and a lawyer she had arranged. I called Patricia immediately. I told her what the nurse had said. Patricia's response was measured, but I could hear something shift in her voice. She said that if what the nurse described was accurate, if a will or codicil had been executed while my father was hospitalized following a stroke, that raised very serious questions about testamentary capacity. Testamentary capacity is the legal standard for whether someone is mentally capable of making a valid will. It's not a high bar normally, but a person in the acute phase of a stroke on medication in a hospital bed is a very different situation. She said we needed to document everything the nurse was willing to tell us. Carefully and officially, we met with the nurse. Patricia handled the meeting. The nurse was nervous, and I understood why. She wasn't sure she was doing something she'd get in trouble for. Patricia explained that she was not being asked to do anything improper, that she was simply providing information relevant to a legal matter, and that if it came to it, her account would be treated with appropriate care. The nurse told us everything she could recall. The date, the approximate time, the description of the attorney, a man, dark suit, briefcase, middle-aged, the fact that my father had seemed confused during the interaction, the fact that he had asked once where he was. Where he was. My father asked where he was, and someone put documents in front of him and asked him to sign. I want to take a breath here because this story is about to get more complex, and I need you with me for all of it, because what happened next, over the following 4 months, was a kind of slow accumulation of facts and documents and conversations that you don't see in movies, but that is the actual substance of how justice sometimes works. It's not a single dramatic revelation. It's 30 small things that together become undeniable. My father came home from the rehabilitation facility. I tried to visit him twice. Both times I was told by Renata that he was tired, that he wasn't up for company, that she'd let me know when he was feeling better. I sent him letters, physical letters, handwritten, sent to the house. I don't know if he received them. I called his cell phone, a number he'd had for years, and it rang out every time. I later learned from his neighbor that she had seen Renata answer his cell phone on at least 2 occasions when she happened to be nearby. My father died 11 weeks after he was discharged from the hospital. He was 67 years old. The official cause was complications from the stroke. His neighbor called me because, again, Renata did not. The funeral was brief and uncomfortable. I was there. I was civil. I spoke to my father's oldest friends, and I held it together because I had been preparing myself emotionally for this moment for over a year, and also because I knew that what came next was going to require everything I had. Renata's attorney contacted me 9 days after the funeral. He was a polished man who spoke in the careful, flattening language of someone who deals with difficult families professionally. He informed me that my father's estate was in the process of probate. He informed me that under the terms of my father's most recent will, the estate, including the house, the rental property, and all financial accounts, had been left entirely to Renata. He informed me that I had not been included in the will. He said this as if it were simply administrative information, a scheduling update, a matter of paperwork. He asked if I had any questions. I said I would be in touch through my attorney. I called Patricia within the hour. She had been waiting for this call. We had been preparing for it. And now everything we had built, the timeline, the documentation, the nurse's account, the copy of the original will, the recordings, the neighbor's statements, the evidence of isolation, the hospital incident, all of it was going to be tested. Patricia filed a formal will contest. The legal grounds were twofold: undue influence and lack of testamentary capacity. Undue influence, claiming that Renata had systematically isolated my father, controlled his access to independent counsel and relationships, and used her position to override his independent judgment in executing the new will. Lack of testamentary capacity, focusing specifically on the document executed in the hospital, arguing that my father's condition at the time meant he did not meet the legal standard for knowingly and voluntarily making a testamentary decision. The moment that contest was filed, things changed. Renata's attorney, who had been speaking to me like I was a minor inconvenience, suddenly had a different energy. Because a filed contest means discovery. It means both sides have to produce documents. It means depositions. It means the timeline of events and the circumstances of the will's execution become subject to examination. It means that nurse's account becomes something that can be verified or disputed through medical records and hospital logs. It means that the attorney who witnessed my father's signature in a hospital room 2 days after a stroke has to explain himself. And it means that I get to walk into a courtroom holding a copy of a will that my father gave me himself, in which he clearly and unambiguously expresses intent to leave everything to me. And I get to ask why. In the months after a woman isolated him from everyone who loved him, that intent suddenly changed. Patricia told me before we went to court to prepare myself for it to be hard. She told me that the opposing side would try to paint me as a difficult, a strange son who had been cut out for legitimate reasons. She told me that Renata's attorney would try to establish a narrative in which my father made a free and deliberate choice. She told me that the legal system is not a story, and that justice is not guaranteed, and that sometimes the truth isn't enough. I appreciated her honesty. I needed it, but I also knew what I had. And what I had was something that Renata, in all her careful strategizing, had not accounted for. She had planned for everything except the fact that my father, years ago, in an act of ordinary and loving practicality, had handed his son a copy of his will and said, "Keep this, just in case." He had no idea how prophetic that moment would turn out to be. The night before the first court date, I sat in my apartment with that shoebox in front of me, and I read those pages one more time. My father's name at the top, the date, the language that is dry and formal the way legal language always is, but underneath which was simply a father saying, "Everything I build is for you." I thought about every Sunday phone call. I thought about him teaching me to drive in the parking lot of a shuttered department store. I thought about him sitting beside my mother's hospital bed, holding her hand, not saying anything, just being there. I thought about who he was before someone decided to take advantage of the loneliness that grief had left in him. And I thought, I am going to walk into that courtroom tomorrow, and I am going to make sure that what he actually wanted is the thing that gets honored. The opposing attorney, as Patricia predicted, came in confident. He had a narrative and he delivered it smoothly. My father had grown distant from me over the years. My father had found love and chosen to build a new life. My father had made a deliberate, considered decision about his estate that reflected his final wishes. He characterized the will contest as the act of bitter, disinherited child who couldn't accept his father's choices. Then Patricia stood up. She didn't raise her voice. She never does. She simply began to present the timeline, the marriage, the isolation, the phone call frequency data, the neighbor statements, the closed bank account, my father's old friend's account of being unable to reach him, the hospital incident, documented in my notes from the parking garage, cross-referenced against hospital visitor logs we had obtained in Discovery. And then she presented the nurse's account, the lawyer in the dark suit, the documents, my father asking where he was. And then she put the original will, the copy my father had given me, authenticated through handwriting analysis and cross-reference with Gerald's records of when it had been executed, on the table, and she asked a simple question. She asked when exactly this man's intent had changed, and under what circumstances. Do you think the court believed him? Part 2 drops tomorrow. If you've been following us from the start, make sure you're subscribed because the courtroom portion of this story goes places I genuinely didn't expect. And if this kind of content resonates with you, real stories, real legal drama, real consequences, there's a full playlist waiting for you right now.